So first and foremost, what I'm going to do is in the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to try to distill 4 years of work and everything that we've done to put this book together. It's very challenging to do so because I could literally spend hours talking about this book. But I'm going to give you some of the highlights. You know, one of our biggest objectives with this book was to, yes, learn and write as much as we could about bread, but also find ways of communicating that to a diverse group of people. Our first publication was Modernist Cuisine. It came out 2011. It was a very elevated information. It was you know, for professional chefs. So a couple years later, we came out with the at-home version of that. And so what we're trying to do with this book is make it for a large group of people that can encompass professional bakers, but also home bakers and restaurant bakers, which is the third category that not too many people think about. Some restaurants make their own bread. So this bread that you see here is, I think it's probably one of my favorite breads. It's a chocolate cherry sourdough. And it's so good that I told my boss we should just write the book about this bread and just call it good, because it is a fantastic bread. So with that, we're going to get started. A quick video. It always gets me pumped to watch that video. It's those drums or something, but it's also we're at this point, we're pretty much done with all of the writing and all the text. It's literally being printed right now, so I can't wait to see it in a couple months. But let's get started. So this is the team right at the center. That's Nathan Mervold. He's basically the founder. He's the guiding voice. And this is my team of chefs and food scientists that work with me every day. This is our kitchen. I love our kitchen. It is such a fantastic environment to work in because we basically have 3 distinct environments. We have a professional environment or professional kitchen / bakery in which we have the big ovens, we have the big machines, we have all of that powerful stuff that is utilized for large production, but we also have the home stuff. So we have a home oven, we have home mixers, we have all of that small scale equipment as well. But there's a third and maybe not as obvious component to our kitchen, which is we have a lot of laboratory equipment. A lot of things that we do, we have to utilize lab equipment to measure results. We've performed 1,500 experiments in this book to come up with results. Sometimes we didn't get the results we wanted, but sometimes we did. But we need to have all of this scientific equipment to measure these things so that when we make a statement, we have something to back it up with. So this is our kitchen. This is what the book is going to look like, 5 volumes and a kitchen manual. We have same page count, although I would also argue that it's a little bit bigger than our previous book. It says same page size, but I think we're maybe 100 pages over than Modernist Cuisine. 1,200 plus recipes. 1 million words, that's a lot of words. 5 research chefs, I include myself in that group, and a group of 75 writers, researchers, recipe testers, etc. There are chapters that, if it was a history chapter, we had a historian write. If it was a microbiology chapter, we had a biologist write. So there are things that are super specialized that we hired other people to write for us. So my job was to write all of the technique and recipes, so basically volumes 3, 4, and 5. So these are the covers of our volumes. This is volume 1. It's the history and fundamentals. We talk a lot about history. We have some historical recipes in this chapter as well. turns out bread didn't used to be that good. And this is important to remark because there's a big movement to go to how bread used to be made, the old days, you know. And so people forget a couple things. Flour sucked. If you wanted to make bread in, let's say, the 1890s, you'd be lucky to get a loaf of bread that was palatable for our taste today. The other thing is that ovens were not as good as the ovens that we have now. So granted, wood-fired ovens are good for certain breads, but it's not good for big, larger loaves of breads, or not as good. We think that the best bread is not in the past. We strongly believe that the best bread is actually in the future. We have better flours now. We have better understanding of the ingredients. We have better access to flour. And we have better equipment to mix it in. So this is our second volume. It's a volume that is based on all of the ingredients. There's obviously 4 basic ingredients that we consider when we talk about bread: flour, water, salt, yeast, which is when I first interviewed with Nathan, I was wondering if we were even going to come up with one volume about something that only contains 4 ingredients. And here we are, 4 years later. We've actually had to trim information off, cut recipes, because we would have just had a couple more volumes. So it's starting to get a little bit out of hand. So this chapter is about those ingredients, but also we talk about yeast in depth. There's a lot of the science that goes into these ingredients, but also how they're made and where they come from. Techniques and equipment. So this is basically the volume that is fully devoted on all of the techniques and methods to make bread. Basically, it's from weighing your ingredients, to mixing, to shaping, to proofing, to baking, and all of the steps that can be in between that. And then we have 2 volumes that are recipe volumes. We have volume 4 and volume 5, and then we have a recipe manual. Recipe manual is basically a abbreviated version of all the recipes condensed in something that you can actually bring into your kitchen that is not 5 volumes large. So it's a portable version with all of the recipes in it. Some of the things that we talk about, for example, is the wide world of baguettes. So you'd think that in a craft that needs to be as precise as baking, that a lot of bakers would agree upon what goes into a baguette, right? How much water should it have, how much salt, how much yeast, what type of yeast to utilize. It turns out if you ask 10 bakers what a baguette should be made of, you will probably get 10 different answers. It seems that what everybody agrees upon is just the shape. And so what we did is we plotted, basically we went through a bunch of books, like a lot of books, and we tested a lot of those recipes. We wanted to find, why does this person add, X amount of salt? Why does this person actually add an egg to a baguette dough, which is something that typically is not done. So we tested hundreds and hundreds of loaves. These were the ones that we thought were representative of extremes. Some of them turned out pretty good, some did not, but all of these are from a well-known baker. We don't name the baker because we don't want to embarrass anybody. Well, some of them actually turned out nice, but the whole point was not to name anybody or single anybody out. The point is to show that there's a huge disagreement as to what baguettes should be made of or what they should look like. Close look at a wheat and what it's made of. We have a couple of microscopes in our lab that are pretty incredible. We have a scanning electron microscope in which we can take a close look at wheat, the bran, the germ, but also as close as really looking at what yeast looks like up close. So some things that we are kind of known for in our lab is for cutting things in half. So we cut ovens in half, we cut pressure cookers in half. This time we wanted to cut a deck oven in half, but nobody would give us one to cut in half. I don't know why. But KitchenAid was gracious enough to give us a mixer that we can cut in half. And so an interesting story behind the stuff that we cut in half is that before I started working here, I thought that the machinist would just like put it through a bandsaw or water jet. But in reality, what they do is they take the whole thing apart, cut each piece in half, and then put it back together again. It's insane. And it's the proverbial looking under the hood. How do things work? And we do this not only with mixes, but also with dough, taking a close look inside dough. So we discovered a bunch of things about bread, which in the next few minutes I can't really go over because there's a lot of things that we found, a lot of exciting things, some things that are completely new to us, things that might be there's a lot of myth when it comes to bread making because it's just been connected to mankind since mankind has been mankind. And so there's a lot of folklore that is attached to it and a lot of sentimental attachments to things. And so some of those things hold water, some do not. And so these are all of the things that we talk about in our book. This is, we look inside machines, but we also look inside dough. This was a pretty fun experiment to do, which was to just see what happens to dough when it's proofing. So it's a time lapse of dough and all the yeast fermenting. Actually, we put more yeast in this dough than we typically would, so we could get like a really dramatic expansion. But it's really cool to see as a baker or somebody who's working with bread how these cells inside the dough form. Dough CPR, one of the biggest things that we talk about in our book is waste reduction. There's a lot of waste with bread, and the reason why there's a lot of waste with bread is because we consider it a cheap thing, right? There's half a baguette left over, stale. Are you really gonna eat it? Well, no, just throw it away. Or some people make crumbs. Some people, actually go through the effort of making like a panzanella. But for example, when it comes to dough and you're making dough, one of the biggest fears that bakers have is overproofing their dough. What does overproofing mean? It means that the yeast really went to town eating all that sugar, you forgot about it, you come back and the dough has deflated. And so that's a really sad image because, if you've seen a deflated balloon, it's the same thing. It's that sense of like sadness and just that deflation of something that should be like nicely blown up. So what we found is a technique to basically bring the dough back to life. So we did come up with this cheesy acronym, CPR, but it's basically what we're calling it is carbohydrate protein resuscitation. We had to make it work. We forced it, I suppose. But essentially what it consists of is taking the dough out of the basket that we proofed it in, reshaping it, and actually let it go again. Because the yeast is still there. The yeast is not dead. What happened to the dough is that it had too much CO2 inside, too much alcohol, and at one point, like a balloon, the dough can't handle it, and it pops. But if you reshape it, put it back in the proofer, the yeast will start working again. In fact, with this dough, we did that 10 times with one dough. So this was really just to prove a point. Because if you forget your dough 10 times, you have bigger problems. Namely, you need to buy yourself a timer or something to remind you of your dough that is proofing. Talking about waste again. So we are talking about levain, and for those of you who might not be familiar with the term, levain is, people call it a sourdough, sour starter. It's the wild yeast that basically is used to make breads that have sourdough taste. So if you are baking at home and you're maintaining a levain and you feed it every day, even if you did one of those little 8-ounce mason jars, if you feed it every day for 1 year, you're gonna utilize 100 pounds of flour just to feed it, just to keep it going. So who can do that? Maybe somebody can, but thinking in those terms of just wasting all of this flour if you're not making bread every day. And a lot of people at home will not be making bread every day. So what do you do with all this starter? Our proposal is that you actually put in a Ziploc bag, freeze it. Why is that? While it might not be very active when you thaw it, what you have in there already is flavor, and you already have hydrated flour. And hydrated flour means less mixing time. So then how do we leaven this bread? What do we add to it? Essentially, we just add commercial yeast to it, because you already have all the good stuff from the sourdough. So if you add commercial yeast, you'll have a beautiful loaf of bread by the time it's all said and done. So this is an easy solution on reducing waste. And that loaf looks beautiful. So that was made with sourdough that was already expired, but we just added a little bit of commercial yeast, and we had a beautiful loaf of bread. People at home don't really have what are called proofer retarders. A proofer retarder is a big piece of equipment in which I, pro baker, can put my dough in, set it to cold temperatures, let's say 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is our favorite cold proofing temperature, and then program it so that 6 hours later it starts to warm up, and then by the time I come back to work, my dough is ready to bake. How would you do that at home? Your fridge, you can't do that with your fridge. The fridge goes to 39, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that's it. and you wouldn't want it at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. But the good news is that you can go to the Home Depot and buy a $70 wine cooler. You might already have one. And there you could proof your bread in there. And it produces, for us, it produced the most amazing results, specifically with sourdough breads. We also developed, I'm going way over time here, aren't I? Okay. We developed a sourdough levain that is for sweetbreads. I don't know who here has made panettone. I know some people don't like panettone because maybe they've had those commercially made panettones that are made God knows where, shipped for weeks and sit on a shelf somewhere for a long time. People might not be fans of it, but a really well-made panettone is delicious. The problem is it takes about 40 hours from beginning to end. So we developed a technique in which we trained our sourdough, our levain, to live in an environment that was full of sugar, because it turns out that yeast and sugar don't get along very well. Creates this thing that's called osmotic pressure, which means that basically the dough and the water and the sugar, they want to keep all the water to themselves and they don't want to share it with the yeast. So the yeast has to work harder and harder and harder to ferment. But it turns out if you feed your sour starter with a little bit of sugar every day for a couple of days, it'll start to get used to that environment. You're essentially training your levain to live in that environment and be okay with it. So what this did is it shaved off a good 16 hours to the whole process, which if you're a professional baker, time is money. Very narrow profit margins can be greatly increased if you actually can reduce the time it takes you to make things. Austrian rye flour was one of the revelations that we found in this book. I'm not going to get too much into it, but look at the difference in fineness from all the way to the left to the right, what particle size can do to your loaf of bread. And it's not to say that one is better than the other, but it really exemplifies what it does to dough. This was one of the most amazing things, I think. This made me super happy because we developed a technique for baking bread in a jar and canning it, essentially preserving bread for long periods of time. We have loaves of bread in our lab that are about 6 months old now, and they're as good as if they were baked yesterday. So we have this whole technique developed in the book. I'm not going to go into specifics now. It didn't work with every bread, but it worked with a lot of breads. And so it's a really good way of either giving a gift or just having bread in your pantry that you can take out of a jar whenever you need it. So we tested how much water you can add to flour. 120% is the sweet spot. Anything more than that, it's batter. Fat has a role in dough, and so in this case, we tested how much fat we could add to dough, and it turns out you can add even more butter than flour in a dough, which is crazy, but it's delicious, actually. And then we cook with a bunch of purees. We have tables in which we baked with a bunch of purees, so basically this is a starting point. And we tested it with a bunch of recipes, and we provide all of these recipes in the book. The role of mixing, not going to get too far into it, but it is essentially misunderstood, so we have a whole series of experiments that we did with this. Sourdough mythology, raisins and water. A lot of people use this to get their levain started. Essentially all you need is flour and water. And you can see, this actually would require a lot more explaining, but I'm just way over time. So why steam makes bread crispy, in-depth explanation of that, and it looks like I am done. Thank you.